Welcome to the NewSpace India podcast, a bi-weekly talk show that exclusively captures insightful conversations with people contributing to advancement of space activities in India. The NewSpace India podcast is pleased to announce our association with Dassault Systems, a global leader in providing business and people with collaborative virtual environments to imagine sustainable innovations. Dassault Systems solutions support startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, and original equipment manufacturers in developing disruptive solutions for space launches and satellite propulsion. Recently, a supply chain digitization study with Dassault Systems was conducted to provide a foundational understanding of the supplier landscape in the Indian space ecosystem. Please use the link in the description to download the public white paper of the results of this study, which will also give you a perspective on how ready Indian suppliers are to enter the global space market. Sudarshan, welcome to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast.
Thank you, Narayan.
So you have been involved in the early days of ISRO and industry cooperation and the whole thing of how we see today coming together with many missions and tremendous amount of industry being involved in the space program. So I wanted to take time to converse with you on how this came about and how the early days of cooperation between ISRO and industry happened. Before we do that, can you give us a little bit about your own background on how you got involved in ISRO?
I did my chemical engineering from IIT Madras, immediately followed up with my IIM Ahmedabad MBA. So I passed out in 1970, and father of the Indian space program was there, who was also the founder of IIM Ahmedabad. He had also, earlier, 2 years earlier, given me from his hands my degree in IIT Madras convocation. So he interviewed me at IIM Ahmedabad campus, and I shown some interest in the space program at the time. He was the chairman of the nuclear program after Baba died. So I showed some interest in the nuclear program. Space program was infinitesimal. I'm talking of 1970. Just about started. So he wanted me to join his group in Bombay called the Program Analysis Group. So I told him that, sir, I just accepted a job from Sandoz, and according to institute rules, I cannot go for a second job. Those were the rules at that time. So he just laughed, and I interpreted that as if I'm keen, I should make the effort myself. So I rang up Mr. Nehru, who had recruited me in Sandoz, BK Nehru's son, and he laughed and said that if you want to go and join Dr. Sarabhai, I think it's a great idea. You should do it. And don't worry about the institute rules. I'll speak to the director and get you relieved from those rules. So that's what happened, and that's how I took up a job at half the salary that Sandoz had offered me. And that's how I joined the program analysis group of Vikram Sarabhai in the nuclear program. Now, this group was quite exciting. It was a techno-managerial consultancy, internal consultancy group of the nuclear program, brainchild of Dr. Sarabhai. Very few of us, 3 or 4 of us, and kept expanding. Then suddenly, within 2 years, Dr. Sarabhai passed away, and I still continued in the nuclear program. I was in charge of all studies to do with the applications of isotopes and radiation in health, food preservation, in industry, in agriculture, everything. So I was kind of focal point in ISRO, in atomic energy for this. Soon after, a few years later, I was getting requests from ISRO headquarters, which had been set up in Bangalore, to see if I was interested in joining them. I showed interest, and that's how I shifted to Bangalore and joined ISRO headquarters under Professor Satish Dhawan, who succeeded Sarabhai as chairman. So that's how my involvement in ISRO started, 1976. That is 6 years after I joined atomic energy. 6 years I spent in atomic energy, and then many years in ISRO after that. I was put in charge as the nodal point of the space program for propellants, chemicals, special materials, composites, and things like that, and a few other portfolios. So I was the focal point of a program which really accounted for about 50% of VSSC, Vikram Sarabhai Space Center. So that kept me very busy, but very soon I realized that there's much more to it, that I have to find suppliers or industries within India who would be willing to put their necks out and take up responsibilities to take our technologies and scale them up and set up industries. I was very keen on the private sector at that time, and one or two experiments of mine in the public sector did not do well. So I was focused on small, medium entrepreneurs, techno entrepreneurs in the private sector. We also offered simultaneously a technology transfer program for our technologies and identified 100 technologies of ISRO from various centers, mostly from Vikram Sarabhai Space Center, but other centers as well, for transfer. A few of these were technologies which could be jointly scaled up with the private sector company and then transferred. And a few of them also were technologies which could be transferred and the products bought back by ISRO. They were also required by ISRO as well as others. So we had several categories of people and strategies were defined for each category. We identified 100 plus critical products and technologies. I identified this list. This list was critical because there were 7 countries, the Western countries, had imposed sanctions on India after the nuclear blast from 73 or 74 onwards. Atomic energy was under severe restrictions, and ISRO was also being affected by that. So 1976 onwards, I identified these products as critical for us to indigenize or develop new routes and get them transferred to industries within India. So there's were 100, approximately 100 products and technologies. So this was done, and I remember showing it to Professor Satish Dhawan, my boss at that time, and he said, "I agree with you, but you'll have to do this very confidentially." I understood what he meant and went about a very confidential, quiet program to transfer these products and technologies. It started working when I joined in 1976. ISRO had indigenized, ISRO had transferred only 2 technologies, both from VSSC, and by the time I left, which was in 1988, when I left the space program, we had transferred some more than 100 technologies from ISRO to industry, mostly to private sector and mostly to small and medium companies in the private sector. But there were also exceptions. There were large ones like you have identified, Walchand Nagar, Godrej, L&T, HAL, which took up large jobs which small companies could not take. And there were also companies which were, I would say, medium to large, like MTAR Hyderabad, the companies of this kind, which showed a lot of interest those days. But the majority of companies in India were hesitant not to take our technologies, but were hesitant to get into buyback guarantees and things like that, or do joint development, because they were not very convinced. They were not sure that we would not be like any other government department. So this took some time to convince the private sector, and we had to encourage the private sector to join hands with us. It was a campaign which was done relentlessly, and it worked. I'm happy to say that by the time I left ISRO in 1988, there were only about 2 or 3 out of the 100 that were left, which are still in the process of getting indigenized in the private sector. So this was what happened in ISRO, and we had to support the private sector companies, small, medium, large, in many unusual ways to win their trust, to win their confidence. One example is Andhra Sugars in Andhra. It's a medium scale company. They were very keen on 1 or 2 technologies from us for liquid propellant, UDMH, which we badly needed to indigenize in India for our liquid rockets. They had some hesitations about, what scale. Our scale looked very small for them. So they were wondering what is the future if we take up this technology, and they had to set up a plant to produce the product and sell it back to us. So did some research and found out that there is a chemical that is being imported from US to India and comes to Madras. And when we analyzed it, we found out that it was just a 2% solution of UDMH, nothing else. UDMH plus water. So we pointed this out to these people, Andhra Sugars, and they asked, what is this being used for? We don't know. So we figured out that this was used by apple growers in Himachal Pradesh and Jammu and Kashmir for apples in very small concentrations for growth of these apples. It was a growth promoter for apples, which made them very red and very lustrous. So they immediately found an import substitution market in Jammu and Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh, and their quantities that they required that they could market went up many-fold. So this is one example where we had to go the extra mile to convince people in the private sector to take up our technologies and make a success of them. The other one was a strange case where we wanted a solid propellant binder called HTPB, very critical for the future of the solid propulsion in ISRO. It's being used even now. This was, I'm talking about mid 80s. So we took up the matter with only two companies in the country, one in the private sector and one in the public sector, who were capable of doing this because they had the infrastructure. One was IPCL in Baroda, and the other was NOSL, National Organic Chemical, this is in the private sector near Bombay in Panvel. So we initially ruled out IPCL, then tried to induce NOSL to take this up. The managing director laughed at me when I approached him to this proposal. He said, Mr. Sudarshan, we take up a minimum of 30,000 tons for a product for us to produce, and you're asking me to do 30 tons. How is that possible? So, I mean, it didn't go well, and we parted as good friends. And lo and behold, 2 months later, I get a call from Mr. Patwardhan of NOSL, managing director, told me, look, we are being asked by the Department of Chemicals in Delhi to vacate our premises in Panvel because of pollution problems. We have tried our best to explain that it's not easy for us to vacate a 30,000 to 100,000 ton plant. So I'm just telling you this because I don't know whether you'll be able to help. I spoke to Prof Dhawan, wrote a letter to Mrs. Otima Bohadia, the Secretary for Chemicals, and explained to her that we are planning to ask NOSL to produce this very critical thing for the space program. Can you please help? If they are to vacate from there, from Panvel, it will be very difficult for the space program to source this because we have been trying very hard to source this from the Indian industry. Sure enough, within a month, a letter came from the Department of Chemicals, Mrs. Otima Bordia, saying, in view of what you have said, we are not going to force NOSL, they can continue where they are. And the pollution barrier on them has been waived. You can realize how happy NOSL was and how happy Andhra Sugars was. In a session in Parliament, I read in the papers, I did not even know that there was such a session going on. This session was started by opposition members. This was during Rajiv Gandhi's time as Prime Minister. Opposition members said that, look, so many government laboratories, they are a waste of money, they are not accountable at all, their performance is pathetic, so on. Now, after hearing from a lot of opposition members, there were two opposition members, one opposition member who was a member of parliament, that was the chairman of Andhra Sugars, who later became Minister Ramaya. He got up and related the story with ISRO on apples and things like that, and how they are prospering because of the government laboratory. And simultaneously, there was an article by Mr. Patwardhan saying, look, this is what ISRO has done for us. So let us not tar everybody with the same brush. That was the end of the debate in Parliament. And ISRO got a lot of mileage for that. So by that time, our stock was pretty high. We were getting successes in the space program and satellites and so on. But this was very much talked about, that we have spin-off benefits, that we have spin-off technologies, and we are helping industries in various other areas, spin-off areas, not just directly in the space program, for the space program. So these were some of the instances that I can relate where we needed to go well beyond our mandate and go far beyond to convince the private sector that we are with you, be with us, and we can do this together. Of course, the public sector companies like BEL, HAL, their role continued. HAL and BEL were critical for us. We set up separate divisions called ISRO, HAL, ISRO, BEL divisions for furthering the joint activities of ISRO and BEL and HAL, etc. But it was realized very clearly right in the beginning that there's a great need to open up to the Indian industry as a whole, and much of it is going to be in the private sector. So this is an adventure that started in the late 70s and went on and on and on. It was more than a decade, the program, till I left, and I think it's still going on. I had just convinced cabinet that we should have a separate organization called Antrix, Space Industry Cooperation, Antrix, and to give a boost to export of satellites, launch vehicles, services, components, subsystems, and technologies. We were keen on exporting technologies and products. We opened all agreements of which we had with the private sector to enable them to export seamlessly. We only put one caution that if they want to export to two particular countries, you can guess who, they'll have to take our prior permission, otherwise they're free to export. So this was very much appreciated by private sector partners, and we used to get very good reports about the quality of the products that were being exported by the industry here. So this was a real adventure, and there were hardly any critical materials after the 10-year or after the 10-12-year campaign. Hardly any critical materials or components or technologies that we needed to. We really found them critical. We had become self-sufficient. I think it can be illustrated if you look at the total indigenous content of launch vehicles or satellites of different countries. Take all countries in the world, look at the indigenous content. No country in the world will have such a high indigenous content as India to ISRO. No country in the world, because all of them could import from anywhere. We had restrictions on us, so we used that to our advantage to make it an indigenous program, a highly indigenous program. This also explains what people don't understand, that our satellites and launch vehicles are by far the cheapest in the world. They are made in India. Their components are made in India. Subsystems are made in India. Very few things are imported. So this is the story of the indigenization campaign, self-sufficiency campaign. It was in a sense forced on us because there were 7 countries, the Paris Convention, 7 countries which said, look, it barred India from importing anything. There were, and all these 100 that I listed were all in that list banned for India. There were some funny things also that happened. The US, NASA used to import ammonium perchlorate, which is the oxidizer for solid propellants, from a big Canadian plant. It so happened, unfortunately, that one day the Canadian plant blew up. NASA was desperate. They had at that time, only 2-3 sources. One was Japan and another was France. The Japanese raised the price tremendously, and France regretted that it could not, it needed it for its own program, and could not supply more than the quantity which was too limited for NASA. So NASA did a search and found that the Indians have a plant or 2. We had set up a plant in Ambernath near Bombay, and one in ammonium perchlorate plant in Alwa in Kerala with our own technology. The technology that started with Karaikudi, CECRI, which was scaled up by us and made a big plant, and we doubled the capacity of this plant. So they approached us very tentatively. What we did was we played a bit of a game. We offered them any quantity that they wanted because we said we can scale up our plant in no time, and we said this will be the price, which is probably the cheapest in the world. They can't get it at that price anywhere. And we also told them this is our quality and sent them the quality. And we also told them that the feature of our ammonium perchlorate is it is not bimodal like it is elsewhere in the world. It is trimodal, which will improve the combustion quality, combustion capacity tremendously. They were surprised. They didn't believe us. They asked for a sample. I wrote back to them asking, how much do you want? How many tons do you want? They only wanted a sample. So we were playing the fool with them. So we sent them a big sample, and they analyzed the big sample and then came back and said, we are interested in buying. They said, you can come to either Bangalore or Bombay for negotiations. And they said, we're sending a small team. He said, I insist that you send somebody from the Commerce Department. They were a little puzzled. This is a matter that could have been handled directly by NASA, and there was no need for Commerce Department. I insisted you must send somebody from the Commerce Department along with you. So the team came and we negotiated. I gave them the best possible price they could have got, which was peanuts, and assured them quantities. Okay. Then I looked at the Commerce Department man who had come and said, look, you're one of the 7 countries that have banned India from receiving any of these 100 critical items. One of them happens to be ammonium perchlorate. You banned it for export to us and you want us to supply to you. Fine, no problem, no issue. All we want is you remove the ban on the remaining items for export to India. Though we have indigenized most of them. They said, how can we do that? I said, look, we are both democracies. Now, tomorrow, somebody in parliament will get up and say, will the Prime Minister be pleased to state why ISRO is supplying so and so critical material to the United States when the United States has banned it from supply to ISRO? What will the Prime Minister of India do? He got the message. They went back. We didn't hear anything about it later, and that was the end of it. So, but this is a stage managed. So this was some of the incidents where we have to go beyond our mandate, beyond our immediate responsibilities to get going. Some of these incidents, I have a belief that eventually that these incidents, these narrations, eventually the public mind, not the public mind, the governmental mind in the US gradually changed. And over a period of time, I think it became more and more favorable towards India. Certainly after 9/11 and all that, it was definitely more favorable to India. Even before that, it started becoming more favorable to India. So I'm glad that I was there during a time of dramatic changes in the policies, which also influenced the policies of the US and the Western countries. Having said that, I must say that even during the worst period, there were 2 countries which were close to India. That was France. Excellent cooperation with India, even during the worst period, and Germany. And France and Germany have remained friends, especially the French, enduring friendship throughout with the space program with ISRO to this day. Germany was being discriminated against after the war, and Germany was not allowed either rocket technologies or nuclear technologies. So for satellites, they found that they could depend on ISRO for small satellites, small rockets. They could depend on ISRO. Friendship with Germany grew in that fashion. We were not equal. We were independent. We could develop what we wanted, satellites or launch vehicles. But Germany had restrictions on it. Most of them are gone now. So this is the kind of friendship we maintain. Of course, with Russia, we had an enduring friendship in the space program. The first first Indian satellite, Aryabhat, was, a lot of subsystems came from Russia, from the USSR, and that friendship has continued. It's an enduring program.
You talked about how Sarabhai recruited you, and then then Dhawan took over, and this earlier industry cooperation with ISRO began with public and then private sector as well.
First chairman of the technology transfer group was my very good friend of mine, Dr. V. Siddhartha.
Right.
But he didn't stay for long. He had, for health reasons, go to Delhi. I took over as the chairman of technology transfer, and then started this program for indigenization, industry transfer. I also started the consultancy service, which was an idea of Dr. V. Siddhartha. The ISRO consultancy service we found could reach us to a large number of small and medium and even large industries, because they started using ISRO facilities and technology through a consultancy service. So they could get closer to scientific groups in ISRO, and they could use our facilities which no industry could afford, testing facilities, for example. So this was a very popular program that hit off very well as soon as it started.
What I wanted you to elaborate is what is the case for industry to collaborate with ISRO in the early days? Because as far as at that point of time is concerned, 70s or so on, there is no big volume in that sense. So there is not many rockets or satellites going up on a yearly basis. Hardly everything being in development and so on. It's
Yeah,
more of a research project rather than a production project. And of course, at that point of time, I could understand that maybe industry is skeptical because this is not a volume game for them. And perhaps there's going to be procurement in the very, very lower numbers, and possibly even in very low timelines as well. As in, it may take years for something to be procured, and not in a matter of weeks or days or so on, which most people expect in industry and in a lot of the SMEs as well. So what is the case for industry development, and when is the exact time frame you think that conversation started within ISRO?
conversation started within ISRO.
Right.
For what?
To involve the industry.
Oh, that was there from the beginning. That was there very much from the beginning. Professor Dhawan was intellectually all for it. Dr. Siddhartha was put in charge of that initially, and I was all for it, no question about that. So, this conversation was going on in ISRO when I joined in 1976. By that time, only L&T Walchandnagar and another company called Anup in Baroda were involved in supplying hardware to ISRO for the launch vehicle program. There were nobody supplying for this anything for the satellite program, nor other materials like propellants, etc. Nobody was supplying. So this is a long felt need. Now, what was your question is what was in it for the private sector? For small and medium people, linking with ISRO had many benefits. They could get consultancy for nothing, for practically nothing. If they wanted to technologies, they could get it for a song. More than anything, the country was churning out people from IITs, etc., who had set up small scale industries in industrial zones like Pina, Rajajinagar, uh, Gindi in Madras, all over the country. Small efforts. Now, they needed help in testing, in consultancy, in associating with our scientists and engineers. Our scientists and engineers in VSSC, Sriharikota, etc., were only too happy to help them, to associate with them, and see that as a partial contribution from them outside the space program. So you had linkages being built up right from the beginning, and these linkages were publicized and became popular, and we used to write about them. That's one of the things I used to do a lot, write a lot about this in the media. So even though this was a fledgling program, this was a tiny program, the space program at the time which you described, it soon became popular beyond its size for what it was trying to reach and do. And we used to get a few responses from our beneficiaries also, who used to write about this. So the news spread among the small and medium sector very fast that there is something you can get from ISRO. Okay, let me give an example. There's a Hyderabad company which was making solar panels. You know very well that satellites require solar panels. This Hyderabad company was making for ground applications, earthbound applications. They were looking ahead, they were looking a little far ahead, and decided that, look, we have to improve our quality if we have to become a global player, small or big. So they wanted consultancy from ISRO, very clever of them, for quality control and improving the quality and going virtually to space quality for their ground-based solar panels. They were not really looking at selling panels for satellites, but they were looking at, how can we improve our quality? If we approach space quality, our quality will automatically improve. It's a very clever ploy by them. It's very clever, very sensible. So we mentioned this to ISRO Satellite Center Bangalore, people there, that small section that was making solar panels, and they were very appreciative of this. They took up this company. Within 1 year or 2 years, I think, they upgraded this company quality control to such a level that this company had no competitor within India at that time. Eventually, of course, a couple of decades later, this company became a global player, shifted their plant to Fujairah, and took over a German company, bought a German company, and became one of the global players in solar panels and solar cells. So it sometimes starts with small beginnings, but if it has the right intention, and more than right intention, if both the parties join hands and sincerely transfer know-how, it works, and it has a great future for that company and for the team in ISRO. What was a great sense of pleasure. We used to nominate the ISRO teams for the national awards, NRDC awards, and practically every year there'd be one award or the other for the relevant ISRO team, mostly from ISRO Satellite Center or Prof Sarabhai Space Center or the Space Application Center in Ahmedabad. So these are some of the things. So those companies who are looking far ahead have benefited a great deal by this long association with ISRO and benefiting step by step. They kept faith. Both sides kept faith in each other, and both have done very well. If you look at that ratio I was saying, that percentage of indigenization in any ISRO satellite is far higher than that of any other country. No other country can match us.
So one of the things that you mentioned there is these buyback schemes and confidence building measures, essentially with the industry to have them work with you. I imagine having read the Department of Space procurement manual, even the recent ones, that procurement through the Government of India rules is a very challenging topic and has been a very challenging topic for a long time, and it's very difficult to move anything beyond standard operating procedures and in procurement rules and everything else, that you can architect something new that can be followed. So I'm assuming that this buyback scheme and technology transfer and everything else that you did with ISRO and in the industry was possibly the first time and the first such template laid down by any government institution in India to work with industry. Is that correct?
I really don't know. If that is correct, I'm very happy. But I don't know. I don't want to take credit for something unique. I don't know. It might not have been done. But I do recall that I had 6 years in atomic energy before I joined ISRO. I do recall fairly clearly that atomic energy was regularly transferring not know-how, worked with the industries like L&T and Walshan Nagar, and we were buying things from them. But these were mainly fabrication contracts. There were no technology transfer associated except expertise being transferred. So I would think that atomic energy came a little close, but ISRO went far ahead.
the buyback scheme and everything else, was it something that was taken on face value, as in that this would be the scheme and this would be the procurement, or did it also have to go through any policy approvals above ISRO, for example, above the Department of Space? And because I'm trying to connect that, because I'm trying to see how that innovation in procurement rules and procurement guidelines can happen today, where the innovation can happen through industry doing R&D also alongside ISRO as of today.
Whenever you transfer a technology to an industry for the purpose of their scaling up, and you want to buy a portion of that back as buyback, automatically when you transfer and they scale up, you'll have to sit with them, hold their hands. So that way, there is a transfer of know-how taking place informally as part and parcel of the technology transfer. While you do this, you will automatically find that we have a contract. We have a technology transfer agreement with that particular company or companies. When we have that contract, as part of that contract, since one of the intentions of the transfer was to productionize that product and buy it back for use by the space program, a clause is put saying that we will give you an assurance to buy back so and so amount, and the rules of government etc cannot come in the way, because we are transferring it to one product, one supplier, one industry or two industries, and we are putting buyback clauses there, so that we need them for the space program. On the one hand, the final product is also required by the space program. On the other hand, it's a technology transfer as part of a technology transfer program. So there's no conflict, no bureaucracy, nothing coming in the way. I don't see, we have never had any problem right from the beginning in technology transfer and buyback agreements. We had to take care of a couple of things. One is partial buyback means the rest can be sold by the industry anywhere. Only there we had to put a cautionary clause saying you can sell anywhere in the world except two particular countries. So that cautionary thing we had to put. Second thing is, we were part of headquarters of ISRO. Decisions were taken by ISRO, and it was our job to convince the department, which was also located in ISRO. So it is no real problem for us. The two ISRO and Department of Space Secretariat worked very closely, and we were benefited by secretaries like at that time Additional Secretary Session, who understood us very well, who had also come from atomic energy and was one of the chelas of Sarabhai. So we had really no problem. Really no problem. Yes, there were some cases where we were doing joint projects with atomic energy. I remember one very well, setting up a beryllium extraction plant and follow it up with a beryllium machining facility in Vashi. It was entirely atomic energy technologies. So you used to get audit queries on that project, because project got delayed by 9 months because there was a sand this thing in Bombay, and they couldn't get sand, and the monsoon was terrible, so they couldn't build. So we had to defend them. We had to defend as one of the beneficiaries of the beryllium plant, and as one of the investors of the beryllium plant, we had to defend atomic energy. And we used to do that. The whole idea was cooperation, not competition. Work together, let everybody benefit. Don't do anything illegal, of course. And then, so this is how the program worked. And the auditor, I remember a case where when this inquiry was going on, I was invited in Bangalore, our office, and the auditor, the number 2 man in the Auditor General's office in Delhi, after an argument about this beryllium and some other project, came up with a very surprising kind of bargain. He said, you agree to what I'm saying on beryllium, and we will drop all things when it comes to UDMH. I thought this was absurd. This is kind of fish market bargaining by the auditor. And a senior man in the government of India in Delhi said, no, under no circumstances will I agree to that. I'll stay by my stand. I'll give it in writing if you want. So that was the end of the matter. So we used to have a lot of things which are unusual in government, because in government, Narayan, you've got to be very deferential. That was the culture, but not in ISRO. Young organization, okay. We had great people in headquarters and in the centers who were very excited working for the program. And originally, we were excited working for Sarabhai. So they were not unnecessarily deferential, they were logical. Many of them had come from IITs and things like that. I had many colleagues who had come from IITs, both in ISRO Satellite Center and Vikram Sarabhai Center and Space Application Center, which is in Ahmedabad itself.
One of the aspects that I also wanted you to address is what is the difference in mindset when you approach public companies and private companies, SMEs? When you approach them, was there any mindset change in, because the incentives are quite different, right? Because for a private company or even an SME in that sense, the incentive is to kind of stay alive and have ISRO as a customer, and ultimately the profit goes down to proprietors and shareholders there. But then the incentive for a public company is much different, where they're looking at supporting the space program, and ultimately it's that's the mandate of the public, for the public companies serve the public in essentially. So do you see any difference in them when you approach them with respect to projects?
I have to talk to you about what used to happen 3 or 4 decades back, because I left the program in 1988. Do you get my perspective? So I don't see very great difference between public and private. Okay, public sector had this problem of being very comfortable with itself. So they didn't uh, they didn't really have to stretch themselves. They would stretch themselves because we were ISRO, we were government, a fellow government, and all that. We could put pressure. So apart from that, there was no real enthusiasm about being associated unless they found some project where there was a common interest. In the SMEs, there was a genuine interest. They wanted to upgrade themselves technologically, and they all knew that the only way to do it was getting involved technologically in higher technologies and higher technologies in the future. So that was the difference in approach. And this difference in approach, we used to leverage, and they used to appreciate that, because we would give them access to our facilities, to our people, to our technologies. So even though we were a high security zone, they could have access, they could walk in, they could show a pass and then walk in. So, so this also resulted in many relationships being built between different sections of different divisions in different ISRO centers and different industries all over the country. So this, you can see the effect of it now. Now that space is being opened up and private people are going to build satellites and launch satellites with official or unofficial help from ISRO, and they're going to make launch vehicles you're aware of. So how did all this happen? It was over a period of time. It didn't happen overnight. It was over a period of time that a number of people, engineers, technologists, scientists in the private sector had this ISRO access somewhere in their careers, and it has led them to start companies in the space sector. You're seeing them now. You're seeing them now going to give competition. Dr. Siddhartha, 30, 40 years back, used to argue vociferously that we must open ISRO to private sector. We must proactively open ISRO to private sector. It was too premature at that time. Nobody was willing to listen to us. Everybody used to laugh and say, how can they do it when we are taking so long to develop and we are facing so many challenges? They don't even have the money. How will they do it? Now that has all been proved wrong. See what NASA did. See what France is doing. Germany is doing. I mean, I don't think Russia is doing much, but I don't know if China is doing anything. But Japan is certainly doing it. So ISRO is now, India has started doing this now. I set up I got the sanction for the cabinet to set up Antrix, which was supposed to be a forerunner for space industry cooperation, for sale of satellites, for export of satellites, for export of launch vehicles, services, everything. So that was in 1970. That was in 1978. I got the cabinet sanction for it. Okay, but it's taken a long time. But Antrix has done well. Now another company has been set up, a overseeing company has been set up there for not only promotion but also regulation of dealings that lead to large exports, large cooperations and exports, collaborations and exports.
Beyond technology transfer and buyback schemes, were there any interest from both ISRO and the industry, for that matter, to come up with any other research and development collaborations that can happen with the industry or in the industry? Because from what I see today, with many of the vendors that have been working with ISRO for a long time, is that they're very capable with respect to manufacturing. They have very good machines, they have very good manufacturing capabilities, and they're very good technical people who focus themselves on process and quality and things like that. But if you go down to many of the industries that are today working with ISRO and serving the larger space and defense and aerospace ecosystem, the one thing that I notice with a lot of these SMEs is that a lot of them don't have design level knowledge, and they have essentially over the last 20-30 years mostly acted as contract manufacturers, including larger companies like Walchan Nagar or even Godrej for that matter with the engines. I'm wondering, when can there be a shift where industry can invest in R&D on its own, or industry can be incentivized to have R&D of its own, and essentially industry can compete to develop their own products?
That's a pretty difficult campaign that needs to be undertaken. So there are a couple of things. ISRO had a program called Space Science Program. Are you getting me? Space Science. A large number of projects under the Space Science Program were with other public bodies or institutions, R&D institutions, but a few were with private sector also, to enable them to develop their research competence or research and development competence. So I don't remember specific projects right now, but there were quite a few. My colleague Dr. Chakravarti used to handle this. There was always this realization that we have to go beyond the immediate. We have to go beyond the immediate requirement, like technology transfer or buyback or whatever. We have to go beyond. We have to go beyond to develop a holistic competence. I do not know how well we succeeded when it comes to competence with respect to space science, research, competence in research, etc. Through our consultancy scheme, many bodies in the private sector, many private sector companies, small, medium, used to work with our people and develop competence in that process. In an indirect way, of developing competence. Like I mentioned to you about the Hyderabad company that developed the competence thanks to us for making solar panels of space quality. So, like that, there was a diffusion that was taking place. So, in a formal sense, there was a scheme. I do not recall how much that scheme benefited private sector companies in developing research competence.
You talked about spin-offs and some of these examples, excellent examples with even the Apple's ones that you quoted and so on. But what I fail to recognize is that there's not been any systematic tracking and economic modeling of a lot of the spin-offs and the benefits that have passed on to the larger economy of the country over 30-40 years of time. And there are, of course, a lot of these mentions in ISRO and in the public sphere, in some of the press statements and so on. But unfortunately, we have not modeled a lot of this economically, and this must have been something that social scientists and economists could have done while keeping track of the spin-off and communicated to the larger public on how the investments made in space have affected the larger economy of the country. And I think some of the countries like US have done this with NASA and other institutions, of course. But why do you think that we missed out on this, or have we missed out at all?
Okay, number one, NASA quantified this spin-off benefits to the US space program, to NASA program. Spin-off benefits. NASA came to did a fairly comprehensive study and came to the conclusion that the indirect benefits, that is the spin-off benefits, they call them the indirect benefits, were about 3 times the direct benefits. That is, they launch a satellite, there are direct benefits. But the indirect benefits, essentially through spin-offs, was 3 times. NASA did a quantification and came with this. This was used to justify the space program in NASA. Next, I do not know of any other country doing it. When it came to ISRO, I was to attempt this. You see, it so happened that I was wearing 3 hats. One was technology transfer and industry cooperation. The other was chemicals, propellants, that very big area, chemicals, propellants, special materials, all that. And the third was I was the director budget and economic analysis. So this was, strictly speaking, my portfolio. I had to do economic analysis. I did not do this satisfactorily because we were still in a period where we were investing in R&D. See, the only success we had when I was there was SLV and the satellites. But there was no ASLV. ASLV both had failed. PSLV had not yet been taken off, not even one successful flight. It was 1 year or 2 after I left that it happened. So the huge investments were going on into the growth. So my role during that period of heavy investment was to ensure that I could get budget approved from Delhi for our program. I was the budget director. So this is a very difficult task for me. It was a very difficult task because Manmohan Singh was the planning commission vice chairman. So it's very difficult to get any money out of him. So I had to play all kinds of tricks to make sure that we were funded, because we were going through a growth period, heavy growth period. And Manmohan Singh used the argument with me that you're an R&D organization, you should grow by 5%, 10%. Whereas I needed 50% more the next year and the year after that. So this is, we were talking of a program growing from 70 crores to 300 crores in 3 years. So I had to put pressure on Manmohan Singh, otherwise we wouldn't have got money and the program would have ground to a halt. So since I had only some support in terms of manpower for this analysis, economic analysis, very rough economic analysis on my part showed that at that time, the spin-off benefits, unlike NASA 3 times the direct benefits, I could not show much of indirect benefits because we are still at the cusp. We still had to go some distance. We are still investing. So this was, you could say, a failure on my part. I really didn't do it. I couldn't do it because I didn't have figures. Now, if I do it, I think I will be in a better position. Or even if I had done it 10 years back, I would have been in a better position.
Thanks for your very clear and honest opinion, and on this. And I wonder, if this should be
something I have to tell you.
Right.
If once we really start exporting, okay, and we start exporting our spin-offs, okay, which we have started doing, actually something is going on, then we'll be in a position to quantify this at least honestly, or at least reasonably well. And you will find that since our investments compared to other countries for the same product of very much less. Okay, and if we start exporting the spin-offs, you will find that we are second to none, because we are 60-70% or more of a satellite or a launch vehicle of ISRO is Indian, totally Indian. It's not the case with other countries. And whereas the spin-offs, if you start exporting, they could be with market forces.
One of the things that is fascinating to me is that you were recruited out of IAMA, and I guess that's a larger vision where possibly the likes of Sarabhai could see that alongside technology or core technology people, there were techno entrepreneurial people who were needed in all of this. And today I see that
it was an exception. The space program was the first. I mean, a nuclear program was the first to do it. Sarabhai was the chairman of the nuclear program. It was the very first to do such a thing in government of India. We were an exception in the government of India. After that, it spread to others. BHEL did it, and many other companies took over. After Sarabhai set the example, it slowly became the norm in other government departments.
And I wonder, it's worthy to even recruit economists, social scientists, and others in the space program as of today, because these people cannot work in the private sector, because there's no incentive for social scientists and economists to work in the private sector with respect to the space program. And it's something that ISRO has to do in that sense, to map this and create enough information for the public to say that why the public needs to support space and what is the benefit of doing more science in the country.
I can quote what happened 40 years back. Okay, in the 70s, Dr. Kirit Parekh, well-known economist, was recruited by Dr. Sarabhai in the atomic energy program. He was my colleague in the nuclear program in headquarters. Okay, outstanding economist. Next, a handful of social scientists were recruited under the SITE project, if you remember, the Satellite Instructional Television Experiment project, which for the first time used the ATS-6 satellite of NASA to broadcast direct satellite programs directly into India. It was a joint program of NASA and India. ISRO, I mean, at that time ISRO, yes. NASA could not keep its target, and instead of 1,000 sets or 10,000 sets, they did half, whereas ISRO exceeded its quota and set up 2,500 sets. I'm talking of television sets receiving directly from the satellite. We are talking of 1976. We are talking of that early days. That is how TV came to India first. So there were social scientists very wisely recruited by Dr. Sarabhai to study what is the impact of these rural programs, TV programs, which were partly designed by social scientists. And ISRO had a very special team called Satellite Instructional Television Experiment Team. And they set up a developmental education cell. Even now it is there in Space Application Center. So they have done some pioneering work. I don't know how much this pioneering work was recognized or seen as an example, but I think it was. I think ISRO was a pioneer. I mean, space was a pioneer. You will find those people, a few of them still there in the Space Application Center and in the Development Education Communications Unit.
Do you get a sense that ISRO has become, from a time that you were possibly from your own, let's say connecting to your venture capital development phase of your career, that has grown, from a young startup to a giant multinational corporation kind of organization? Do you get this feeling now?
Very much, very much. See, even when I left ISRO, I can't think of any great launch vehicle project. PSLV was still going on and I was contributing to it, but it had not been launched. ASLV, 2 flights had failed. Only SLV had succeeded. Satellites were going on. So you compare that with what has happened 30 years later. Within these 30 years, PSLV has become a workhorse platform for ISRO. Many satellites, GSLV, IRS satellites are standard. So now they're talking of more ambitious things like Moon and Mars and all that. I don't really care for them very much. That's a different matter. I was always against those things. But it is a big, why is it a big fellow? Other countries are interested in ISRO for its services, its launch vehicles, its launch services, its satellites, its payloads, etc. Because they cannot get these things cheaper than what they can in ISRO, and they cannot get it in a very cooperative, collaborative manner than they can with ISRO. So this is going to be in the future of ISRO. That is a global player. Right now, you are a small global player. Later, you can become a standard global player. I doubt if you'll ever become a huge global player, but that's a different matter. But you can be a global commercial player in space.
Did you have any, let's say, things that you wanted to do and it never took off, or in ISRO, or things that you thought that could have done differently that you can talk about?
Yeah, there are a couple of things which I think I was totally opposed to. One or two things which I could not fathom. After the first failure of ASLV, the Augmented Satellite Launch Vehicle, we went ahead with the second flight without properly diagnosing what went wrong in the first flight. I felt that there were enough clues in the first flight performance to decide what went wrong and set it right before going for the second flight. I thought this was a blunder which retarded the space program by a couple of years. This is a blunder because both failed. Both failed. So this was one thing. Failed. Second, when I started my career, on the very first day, I joined ISRO from Atomic Energy. I came over from Bombay to Bangalore. There was a thick file waiting for me, and when I studied it, I got a shock of my life. That was a project being pushed by ISRO and being promoted by Professor Dhawan, who is an aeronautics man, for making crude oil out of rare vegetable oils. They were calling it space crude, giving it a fancy name. I went through it and found that it was such gibberish. It was not just chemical engineering, just common sense. And they had also persuaded one of the state governments, West Bengal government, to support them in this. So I was asked to go to West Bengal, and to cut a long story short, I decided that this was being pushed left and right. It was in the newspapers. People were praising it all over the country, and so I had to kill it. So this was one of those occasions where I had to kill a project before it became too dangerous. So I had to kill it. I wrote a long note. Fortunately, on the other side, there was a great economist, Ashok Mitra, who was Minister of Finance for West Bengal government, Marxist fellow. And he understood this, and that was the end of it. And it caused a lot of heartburn among my own colleagues in ISRO. They thought I was, I'm demolishing them. But we had to save the reputation of the organization before it became too bad. So these are some of the things, that is, negative things I had to do and positive things I had to do, where, otherwise, apart from that ASLV blunder on our side, I found that practically anything that I wanted, which I was keen on, was approved as long as my boss was there. And even after Satish Javan retired and URO took over, I had no hindrance. And that was, I was very keen to develop an internal entrepreneurship development program. This entrepreneurship development program, I set my heart to it. So I developed 3-4 entrepreneurs within ISRO, encouraging them to get out and start their entrepreneurships with the blessings of ISRO. This was a very pioneering project. We had given them our blessings, said, you go. If after 2-3 years you want to come back, you are welcome to come back. But these are the supports we'll give you. So this was, I think, 2-3, more than that, teams went out of ISRO. We are encouraging them to go out of ISRO. So this was an entrepreneurship development program. And while doing this, we had to mentor them. I personally took a lot of interest, both with my technology background and IM background. How to become an entrepreneur? What are the challenges and this and that? I used to go around and give lectures in the ISRO centers, and so entrepreneurship was encouraged. And ISRO was the first in government the government of India, were the pioneers to have an entrepreneurship scheme for its own people. And the scheme was attracting interest within ISRO, particularly in the Vikram Sarabhai Space Center, the Space Application Center. And as a result, the word spread around that some classes are being conducted for potential entrepreneurs, and so outsiders used to come and join my classes. So this was another thing that put my heart on entrepreneurship scheme. So when I was doing this, I came across the fact that the country completely lacked venture capital. We were zero in venture capital, whereas other countries like Korea and UK and of course were far ahead and following the example in the US. So I started simultaneously a campaign for venture capital, and this campaign I could not convince my own colleagues in the space program, the bureaucrats. Nobody. The session was sympathetic, but he was not the person to promote this. So finally, after many years, in 1984, I got an appointment to the then new finance minister, Mr. VP Singh. Had a half an hour appointment. I went and told him about the need for venture capital in the country and how there was not enough support has to come from government in our country before the private sector can take over, and private sector is no position. Banking sector itself was hardly anything. So private sector hardly didn't exist for banking. So I told him, he listened to me very patiently, he didn't open his mouth. At the end of it, half an hour, told me, thank you, Mr. Sudarshan, I will do something. So I went away, came back to Bangalore. 2 months later was February. That was his first budget. You can imagine the surprise I got when he announced 100 crores for venture capital in 1984 budget, 1984 or 85. So that was, I so enthused that somebody finally is listening in this country. So I went around, told all my licensees for technology transfer and others that look, some of you will be eligible for venture capital, we'll push you, fund is going to come. It didn't come for 2 years because the ministry people, Ministry of Finance, gave that 100 crores to IDBI, who simply sat on it for 2 years. So to cut a long story short, we finally had to keep on, giving interviews, criticizing IDBI, criticizing Ministry of Finance, etc. And finally, these people showed interest, ICICI, and I got a call, strange call, saying our chairman wants to meet you. And to cut a long story short, I left ISRO and started the first venture capital company in the country. That was TDICI, now called ICICI Ventures. So this was I had strange experiences like this.
Could you recollect any of the industries that are working with ISRO today that have benefited from this venture capital scheme?
Venture capital was not only for ISRO licensees, it was for everybody. So one of the people who benefited was who did consultancy. We provided them consultancy on this satellite panels, okay. It is called RES. At that time, its name was RES, Renewable Energy Systems Hyderabad, RES. Another company which had to make carbon composites is in Pollachi in Tamil Nadu, Carbon Composites. And the name of the company is Advanced Materials, I think. I'm not sure. Forget now. 30 years back. Advanced Materials, okay. Pollachi, for making carbon composites, for making carbon fiber and carbon cloth. Carbon cloth we needed in fairly sizable quantities as the liner for our nozzles, solid propellant nozzles, liner inside. It has to withstand very high temperatures So it's ablative burning has to take place. So it requires that kind of material. Carbon composite was like that. We had to use a combination of carbon composite and glass fiber composite, both. So these are some of the. I told you about the company in Andhra Sugars.
So we know that Tata has been involved in several new sectors over the last 5-6 decades, or even before that, in creating new sectors, or even being the first actors in many such sectors, including airlines and other things. So I was wondering that why hasn't a company like Tata entered space as an area where once commercial communication satellites and others were becoming a reality in US and other places in the 60s and the 70s. Why would a company like Tata or somebody else who are large companies in India did not enter or collaborate with ISRO to eventually produce either DTH satellites or other communication satellites to serve requirements in India?
I also wondered. I don't have an answer, but let's take the larger issue of Tata's and space. Let us say my association started with JRD. I was a very young fellow in atomic energy in Bombay. JRD was in the Atomic Energy Commission, and I was assigned always to escort him to the Atomic Energy Commission meetings. So he got to know me, he used to call me by name. So that was JRD. Always looked upon him as a father figure. And the whole program, Atomic Energy used to look upon him as a father figure. Setna was there, even Sarabhai. They all used to respect him so much. And he was a source of wisdom for the atomic energy program. Now let's come to Ratan Tata. Ratan Tata, very long association, very long association, right from the beginning. And he had a group, a planning group in Bombay House, his headquarters, and he wanted me to join that group. I was not prepared because I had just moved over to Bangalore and I was not keen on going back to Bombay. So I went, met him, and gave my logic. But we maintained some kind of a small, contact. Then I had an opportunity to invite Ratan Tata to ISRO headquarters in Bangalore. I was very happy to do that. And I was asked to escort him around and explain things to him. So I took him for a meeting with Professor Dhawan, and then for a meeting with Professor Yor Rao in the Satellite Center, and then explained a lot of things about the program to him. And it so happened by coincidence that I'd just come out with a booklet, 100-page booklet, which I brought out every year. That the first one came when Ratan Tata visited us in headquarters. I brought out that booklet called Indus Space. That is industry and space, Indus Space. So this was in the mid 80s. So I presented this booklet to him and he was very happy because we had brought out the exact details of collaboration with industry, space and industry. So that was in great detail. I don't know whether they bring it out now. I was bringing it out regularly when I was there. Then I told him about, during that meeting, I told him about composites. We were probably the pioneers in India making composites. We needed composites for the upper stages, motor cases. So there were Kevlar composites, carbon composites, all kinds of composites. Nobody else in the country was anywhere near that for any application. And we knew that, there are many potential applications. He was very attracted. He was very interested in this. And the germ of an idea started here for him to set up the Tata's diversification into advanced materials, which is in Bangalore. The company is in Bangalore. They diversified into that. And they were making Kevlar motor cases. We were making Kevlar composites for upper stages. And here, Mr. Ratan Tata found a logical application for them for ground. And the ground applications are for the armed forces. The Kevlar vests are armor, are a kind of armor for the soldiers, Kevlar vests. So they had apparently bagged big orders from the defense forces. I'm talking about 30 years back. and they started supplying Kevlar vests. But before that, I had advised him, please, Mr. Tata, don't do anything on advanced materials. That is a couple of years before they went in for this company. Don't do anything at all till you do a survey of what are the opportunities in this. Then he said, who will do the survey? I said, I got the man for you. So I asked Mr. C.R. Satya, who was the number 2 after Kalam, he was reporting to Kalam, C.R. Satya, to take on this job of doing a consultancy project from ISRO to Tata's. And he did that within 6 months. He was very knowledgeable, he did that. And that report was accepted by Mr. Ratan Tata, and that was a basis for the company called Advanced Materials, which makes composites, vests, and other things. So that is the story, that is the germ of the, that is the inception of advanced materials, an industry into which the Tatas diversified. But they are making other products, obviously, in this. I was allowed to visit it once. So this is one clear example of how an intimate relationship was developed with Tata, Mr. Ratan Tata's team, and this was done. It led to an industry by itself, and they did it very fast, the Tatas. And Mr. Satya, so happened that they liked Mr. Satya's association so much. Satya was a very practical man and also very good technologist. They gave him a job in Tata's. Poor ISRO had to lose Mr. Satya and joined the Tatas. And finally, say, I used to go around telling people, the heads of various divisions, and the best way to transfer technology is to transfer people. It's not just agreements and things like that and technical stuff, but people. You must allow that. So partly our entrepreneurship program that I set up, and examples like C.R. Satya helped in transferring technologies and doing an outreach with industry, which Mr. Tata appreciated a lot. And Tata's, to come back to your basic question, why not satellites, etc.? I can only answer this philosophically. I have to go to the ethos of Tata's. The Tatas, thanks to JRD, started Air India. The Tatas, not only JRD, but even Ratan Tata, still maintain an interest in aviation. Their interest in aviation is strong. It's now coming back to ownership of Air India, either directly or indirectly, after 30, 40, 50 years. So, aviation is in the Tata's blood. They were divested of their main baby, Air India, where they were pioneers. They were divested. Now they see an opportunity for it to come back to them. So basically, they are keen on aviation. I don't think they want to be distracted with anything else. Also, it is possible they have not done a market survey about satellites and things like that, even though there's some interest in it, because when I took Ratan Tata to the satellite center, he was damn interested. He spent an hour there in the satellite assembly bay asking all kinds of questions. But I don't know if it is in their commercial interest or if they're really given thought to it. If they do a market survey for satellites, etc., or join hands with ISRO, they may find renewal of interest in these areas for them. But please remember, they want aviation at any cost. Others are less priority to them. They may come to um, subsystems of aviation like avionics, which is very important for space. It's also there in airplanes. So things like that, they may come to it, but they're not in it right now. They want aircraft. They want to run aircraft. They want to develop aircraft. And I know this for a fact because long back, 30 years back, when NAL, the late Rodam Narasimha, who passed away last week, Rodam Narasimha was the director. I was a kind of advisor to National Aeronautic Laboratories, and I was going to Bombay, and he told me, "Can you have a word with Mr. Ratan Tata on this?" That we had a project a 9-seater airplane project called Saras, I think. Yeah. So I went to Ratan Tata and told him, I don't know aeronautics myself. I told him, but I was moved by his knowledge about aircraft. Ratan Tata. I thought it was only JRD, but Ratan Tata was also very knowledgeable. He said, no, it cannot be this. It has to be a turbofan. He made it very clear to me what kind of aircraft he thinks will work. He might have been wrong, but he had a clear idea about what he felt was right. So that was Ratan Tata. So definitely that project was set up. Uh, Advanced Materials, it's in Bangalore, for making Kevlar and other products, Kevlar, carbon composites, and so on. So that is one clear example. But looking at it, looking at the size of Tata's, you're right. They have not had many adventures with the space.
One of the questions that I wanted to follow up with you is on the leadership with ISRO and ISRO chairman over the course of 5 or 6 decades or so. If there was like a stated overarching policy on every single aspect of technology and its application to society in India with space, there could have been a certain connect between different chairmen of ISRO that could have happened over generations of different chairmen. But unfortunately, there is not that happening, and also that most often politicians in India don't care about what happens in space technology or other science related aspects as such. So there's no direction laid down by the public representatives in any case for technocrats to follow eventually. How do you see this from your lens over the course of 50 years of your time between atomic energy and space and others?
No question, the overarching interest in society and societal development, social development, socio-economic development. The person who was devoted to it was Vikram Sarabhai, absolutely devoted. So you can see it in every project, particularly the SITE project, Satellite Instructional Television Experiment, plus every other project of ISRO. But Sarabhai died. I joined in 1970 and he passed away within 2 years. I would say that his successor and my boss, my subsequent boss, Satish Dhawan, when I joined ISRO, he was my boss, was equally committed to societal development. Though he was not a social scientist like Sarabhai was instinctively a social scientist. In the case of Dhawan, people don't appreciate that after Sarabhai died and Dhawan took over as the chairman, the organization was actually led by a triumvirate, like the Roman triumvirates, Dhawan as the chairman chief, Brahmprakash in charge of Vikram Sarabhai Space Center, and Yashpal, the famous Yashpal, in Space Application Center. These three together were totally faithful to Sarabhai's philosophy and continued with Sarabhai's philosophy for decades. They actually built the space program. Sarabhai envisioned it. It was these people who built it. So, for more than a decade. So, it is a fantastic triumvirate. And we were very lucky that Sarabhai was succeeded by these three great people. After that, this is after a period of 15 years, I do not see anybody having that kind of social connect. U.R. Rao certainly was not. He succeeded Dhawan. He certainly was not. Then Rangan, hardly anything. One by one. Madhavan Nair, no. Radhakrishnan, hardly anything. Radhakrishnan, incidentally, I was his boss. I trained him. He was my manager in the budget and economic analysis. Much later became chairman. And all the others, none of them is really a social scientist. So that social connect was not there with them. It was not in their blood. So it was there with definitely Sarabhai who pioneered it, and the three people who succeeded him as a triumvirate, Yashpal, Brahmprakash, and Satish Dhawan. They were faithful to Sarabhai's philosophy, utterly faithful. That is what strengthened the organization during a very difficult time after Sarabhai died and set the future for the organization. but the social connect slowly disappeared.
I mean, I'm just wondering, what will it take for the new generations of program managers and project directors and mission directors and directors and chairman and everybody else to connect back to that?
If you ask me an honest answer, I don't know. So they have to be trained, I guess. There, see, many of them have not seen Sarabhai. Some of the chairmen now, I don't know if Sivan has ever seen Sarabhai. They have not seen him. So they really don't know about his philosophy, about his social connect. They don't even know the people in Space Application Center who may have some residue of the social connect in them. So it will be a challenging task to reconnect them to the social connect of Sarabhai. But it is indirectly happening because as it becomes more and more commercial, as you have Antrix and others, going for export, and as demands are being placed, okay. So it has become a given that this is project is a given, that's a given, these are all givens. So we are living on that givens, and we are growing. Growth may have some effect in bringing back a social connect in them, but it won't automatically bring back. It may not even be needed. They must have a program. They must have projects and programs for the social connect. Entrepreneurship is one. They must build entrepreneurship within the organization. I hope it happens.
Formation of a group of social scientists and economists to map all of this and having a rolling framework that numbers can be updated on a yearly basis. I think some of these kinds of experiments can really make
It
that
must be done in
linkages.
the headquarters. For example, ISRO headquarters in Bangalore has got the program analysis group. They must do it. I did not do it. The economics part, I did not do it, though it was one of my portfolios. But it can be done now because there's enough material now to map this.
Given that you've seen this for 50 years now, where do you see this moving in the next 10 to 20 years, given that what you've seen the evolution in the last 50 years? Where do you see all of this heading towards in the next 10, 20 years? Is it more towards, let's go more towards building our own space station and start competing with other countries and use more a soft power approach to space? Is it more, let's do a little bit more of the R&D focus and leave the industry to do a lot of satellites and rockets, and let's more focus towards original R&D and then technology transfer back of new generations of technologies? It's a mix of both, or what is your thoughts on this?
I think it has to be a mix of all three, and you cannot just leave satellites and things, launch vehicles to industry. You have to enthuse industry to make more challenging launch vehicles and satellites, which you can do only by scaling up your own sizes. You got to upsize, and from now on, rope in industry right from the beginning when you're upsizing your projects. Give a bigger role to industry right at the developmental stage for your projects of satellites or launch vehicles. And it has to be soft power as well. Develop your soft power.
So one of the more controversial topics, I would say, in my opinion at least, is this power structure that ISRO has to this date, that may have served it very well until first 10 or 20 years of its development stage, of the secretary of the Department of Space also being the chairman of ISRO and the chairman of the Space Commission. In my opinion, that particular structure might have outlived its time, because the conflict of interest that it may set upon the person who has to also make the rules and follow them at the same time.
See, whoever that person is holding all three of those portfolios, it has to be a very holistic person. Dhawan was like that, Sarabhai was like that, even Kastur Rangan was like that, even to some extent UR Rao was like that. But the others have not been like that. So they don't have that competence. But on the counter, I have a serious problem with splitting up these roles. You have to understand that I come from the atomic energy background. It was the most horrible experience after Sarabhai died when we had Setna taking over as chairman and Ramanna taking over as director BARC, two heavyweights. So they were the two power centers Forget about what the parallel in Department of Space and ISRO. It doesn't matter. They were the two power centers, Ramanna and Setna. The organization, the program went into a toss because these two fellows could never get along with each other. They were pulling each other down. So it was a mess. It was a mess for 10 years. Even after I left ISRO and Atomic Energy and joined ISRO, Dhawan used to call me and complain. Dhawan was in the Atomic Energy Commission. He used to complain that these fellows were always fighting. So, I don't want that to happen. So even at the cost of some conflict of interest, I would prefer in these organizations that you follow the tradition, keep it as long as you can, let it go as long as you can. But you can think of organizational changes below. For example, the one man could be chairman of all three, but the others could be directors of all three, like that. You could have structural changes of that fashion, but there must be one boss. If there are two bosses conflicting, then that's when the bureaucracy gets in India. You had it. Once you give scope for the bureaucracy, you had it. This unitary structure has allowed the bureaucracy to stay away from messing up with the organization. If that had been allowed, the bureaucracy would have been messed up by now. I have very strong views on this, and I know that sometimes a thing may sound bad in paper, but it is better in fact.
For sure, because I have no lived experience of working in ISRO, and that's why I'm here to learn about how that transpires and how that affects
We never had that conflict. You're right. Maybe you are right that it might have outlived its existence and all that. But I come from a slightly different background where I'm scared of splitting the roles. I would like, for example, Chairman ISRO or Secretary DOS to not have a Chairman ISRO. That should be the same. But you can have people, other roles given to your seconds, your lieutenants.
beyond the antrics and the public companies that are in India and so on. What is your opinion of how do you ensure that some of these companies in the private sector glow to the global market, and not just the likes of antrics, but how could you equip them to also participate internationally and be over time grow themselves as the equivalents of Boeings or Lockheed Martins of the world?
Number one, close association with them of all our programs to deal with industry, consultancy, technology transfer. That's number one. Number two, we need to identify our people, key people, whom we should spare to join these companies, like we did with Tata's and CR Satya, without which it will not happen if you want them to grow. Three, you must give them strong buyback guarantees. Four, you can do that by associating them to actually develop subsystems for your projects and buying them back as subsystems, not as components. So these are some of the ways in which you can associate with them. But the most important is, how do you deal with between their people and your people? Okay, do that. Start with even the program that you have in Trivandrum, training people in space technology, space materials, and all that. Associate the people in industry right from this. Bring them not just as trainees, but as professors, lecturers, so on. So it has to be a very close association with industry. They must trust you, and you must be able to trust them. So these are the four ways I think you should be able to do. Work with them. But when I look 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ahead, I know that there will be pressure, politically pressure, to go in for moon landings, Mars landings, and so on. I don't know whether they should be given that higher priority. We need communications, weather, remote sensing, geospatial applications more than anything else, and we don't have enough capacity. Somewhere we are lacking in capacity in terms of whether it's the launch vehicle or the satellites. So even though we have launched 50 satellites and we have fairly decent launch vehicles. We need to scale them up to be able to get what we want. But I think that for a country like India, I don't want to berate what has been done. For a country like India to worry about the Mars and the moon landing and all that is, according to me, it doesn't make sense. We should stick, at least on this front, remote sensing, communication of all types, TV, this, that, everything, and weather, of course. Once it's become affordable, it has become fashionable. Moon and Mars are fashionable now, and Gaganyaan and all that. It's okay, but that's not my priority. My priority is practical applications and export. Why can't you export more?
One of the things that I noticed is that when you compare India and China, for that matter, India has and China, both of them have an extremely large pool of scientists who work abroad or are trained abroad. And I have many friends of mine who have done PhDs in here in Europe or Japan or Australia or US or wherever, and are basically trained scientists inside of NASA or many other space agencies, including DLR and others. And unfortunately for me, I don't see any like mechanism for their lateral entry into ISRO, or in that sense, where I would say some of the other space programs like the Chinese or the Mexican or some of the others have such possibilities for absorbing them at really and creating new wings in them to create those new technologies, and for them to head them, given that they have built up that experience having worked abroad and all of this. And this is one of the issues that I've seen affect hundreds of people who I know personally in that sense, who are working abroad and would like to go back, but it's very difficult to go back.
See, even in the 60s and even in the 70s, this was happening. Quite a few people from NASA, except not NASA necessarily, USA and Europe were coming and joining ISRO, etc., because they had very charismatic leaders here, like Vikram Sarabhai and so on. Very charismatic people. So they attracted people. They right now, or for a long time, I don't see that happening. So far, it has not happened, and there are many factors. One is, do we have a role for them? Okay, because there is pressure from internal promotion requirements. There's a lot of internal people who need to be promoted. Okay, do you have a role for them? Do you have a clear role for them? And can you afford them? And if you can offer them something, will they come? These are all questions that have not been answered. What all facilities can you give them? So this is a problem with our government setup. Though it happened in the 60s, all the top fellows came from the US, etc., in the top 60s, including Professor Dhawan and all. Okay, what about now? It's not happening. It's not been happening for a long time. Even though I remember vaguely that at some stage there was a scheme for this, bringing these people here. And I know that one or two of my colleagues also came, joined ISRO, and moved to EDA, Aeronautical Development Authority, and all that. So it's not there. You have to do it. And I don't think it's easy to do, easy to have such a scheme, though there may be people who may be interested in coming back. As every year goes by, you're finding the gap between the salaries they can get in the US and what we can afford them is increasing, not decreasing. It's not simply not attractive for them to come back. At least if there's a position, there's a clear role, a position, at least that we must create. We have not done that. Everybody may not be interested in salary, but role, position, a challenge that must be identified. But there is a lot of internal pressure to accommodate your own people for any new thing that comes.
I mean, it's one of these fascinating episodes that that you want somebody to talk about, and given your experience of almost 50 years now, having seen everything, it's fascinating to know all the things that you've said, and you've been very honest with what you have said. So I thank you very much for that.
Not at all.
I also have known Dr. V. Siddhartha for 10 years now, and it always escapes me that
he is the man who formally started the technology transfer scheme and then nominated me to take charge when he was leaving. By that time, we had transferred 2 technologies when Siddhartha was there. And I was part of the technology transfer group with Dr. Siddhartha. He was the chairman. And he had actually formulated the consultancy scheme. But he had to leave because of his health problems. He had to go to Delhi. So I took charge.
So, all right. Thank you very much, Sudarshan.
You're welcome, most welcome, anytime.
This was very, very good. I want to explore a newer topic possibly, and gather a little bit more of the thoughts, because the 2 hour information is quite a lot to process. And it's thank you very much again, and
all the best.